All right, so are you ready to dive into this Epstein case?
Oh, yeah, buckle up.
This one is
That's a long one.
yeah, it's a doozy, and we're only doing part of it.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about power and privilege and a lot of unanswered questions.
Lots of questions.
So today we're focusing on how the U.S. Attorney's Office, specifically the Southern District of Florida, handled the Epstein investigation between 2006 and 2008.
Right.
And our main source for this is
Okay,
a big Department of Justice report from 2020.
Yep.
And we're going to try to break it down.
Break it down.
Make it make sense.
Yeah.
So
This case is fascinating.
yeah.
It started with the local police in Palm Beach, and then it just went up and up and up and up
Oh, wow.
to the FBI and federal prosecutors.
Yeah.
And it all started with a 14-year-old girl
Oh, gosh.
and allegations that Epstein paid her for a massage. And sadly, as the investigation went on, it became clear that she wasn't alone.
Oh, no.
There are a lot of victims.
So before we get into the details,
Yeah.
can we just take a step back and just clarify?
Sure.
Who was Jeffrey Epstein?
So Jeffrey Epstein was a multimillionaire financier, and he moved in some very powerful circles. But behind that wealth and influence were these disturbing accusations of a pattern of sexual abuse targeting underage girls.
And the Palm Beach Police Department weren't messing around.
No, they weren't.
He wanted to.
Yeah, they felt that the state charges that were being considered really didn't fully capture the severity of his alleged crimes.
Right.
They wanted some serious action taken.
So they called in the FBI.
Exactly. They wanted a stronger response
Yeah.
from the federal government.
But here's where things get a little messy.
Yeah.
The U.S. Attorney's Office, led by then U.S. Attorney R. Alexander Acosta, decided to resolve the whole federal investigation with something called a non-prosecution agreement, or what we'll call an NPA from now on.
Yeah, an NPA essentially let Epstein off the hook for any federal charges.
What?
Instead, he agreed to plead guilty to just state charges.
Okay.
Serve 18 months in county jail register as a sex offender and pay damages to the victims.
Well, that sounds like a pretty straightforward deal.
Yeah, it does on paper, right?
Yeah.
But there's a crucial detail here that we can't overlook. The victims were completely left in the dark.
What do you mean?
They weren't consulted before this agreement was signed.
Wow.
Imagine being a victim and finding out that the justice system just made a deal with your abuser without even bothering to ask for your input.
Yeah, that's awful.
That's got to be devastating.
Yeah.
And this lack of victim involvement is going to come back to haunt everyone involved later on.
Really?
It's a major reason why this case sparks so much outrage and why it continues to be scrutinized even today.
So Epstein signs this NPA.
Right.
And you would think he would just take the deal and move on.
You'd think.
But no, he had an army of high-powered lawyers working tirelessly to change the deal.
He did.
And he even tried to invalidate the whole thing altogether.
Yeah, he really fought it.
Can you believe the audacity?
His legal team was relentless. They argued that the case was purely a state matter,
Oh, wow.
basically trying to say that the feds had no business poking their noses in.
Oh, God.
And these maneuvers just dragged things out for almost an entire year,
Really?
delayed his guilty plea and his sentencing.
Wow.
It took the intervention of the Deputy Attorney General himself to get things moving again.
Wow.
And even then, things didn't exactly go to plan.
Okay.
So June of 2008, Epstein finally pleads guilty
Okay.
to the state charges of solicitation of prostitution and procurement of minors for prostitution.
Okay.
He was sentenced to 18 months. But hold on to your hats, because the next part is going to make your jaw drop.
Okay, buddy.
The conditions of his incarceration were shockingly lenient.
Really?
He ended up serving less than 13 months in a minimum security facility.
No.
And get this, he was allowed to participate in a work release program
No way.
that let him spend 12 hours a day at an office.
Oh, my gosh.
It was a far cry from the 18 months behind bars that everyone was expecting.
Wow. So you have this situation where the victims are left out of the loop.
Right.
A controversial agreement is made.
Yeah.
And then the punishment seems to completely disregard the severity of the crimes.
It's a mess.
It's no wonder people were furious.
Oh, yeah. And remember, we're still just scratching the surface here.
Oh, really?
There's a lot more to this story.
So the fallout from this is just getting started.
Oh, yeah.
One victim, known as Jane Doe, decided she wasn't going to take this lying down.
Good for her.
She filed a lawsuit claiming the government had violated her rights under something called the Crime Victims' Rights Act, or CVRA. We'll dive into what the CVRA is all about and why it's so important a little later.
Okay.
But for now, I think it's important to note that Jane Doe's lawsuit wasn't the only thing that brought this case back into the spotlight.
Right.
You're talking about that bombshell investigative report by the Miami Herald back in 2018?
Exactly.
That was crazy.
Yeah, that report reignited public outrage and forced the Department of Justice to really take a hard look in the mirror. They launched an internal investigation to try and figure out just what went wrong with the Epstein case.
Okay, so we've got a lot more to talk about.
We do.
But we'll get to that in the next part.
Sounds good.
Oh, man, that Miami Herald report was explosive.
Yeah, like a bomb going off.
It really put the spotlight back on Epstein and that sweetheart deal that he got.
Right.
But it also put a lot of pressure on Acosta, who was serving as Secretary of Labor at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The public outcry was immense.
Yeah.
And the Department of Justice had no choice but to respond.
So they called in their internal affairs team.
Exactly.
The Office of Professional Responsibility.
The OPR.
OPR.
Yeah.
To investigate how this whole Epstein case was handled. So like internal affairs for lawyers.
Exactly.
Okay.
Their job was to figure out if Acosta and his team crossed any lines ethically or legally in their handling of the Epstein case.
So no pressure.
Yeah, right. No pressure.
So they had a pretty big task ahead of them.
Huge.
Right.
Mountains of documents, emails, letters, interview transcripts.
Wow.
The whole 9 yards.
They interviewed over 60 people.
They did.
Including FBI agents, prosecutors, former Department of Justice bigwigs, and even some of Epstein's victims.
It was a thorough investigation.
Yeah.
Trying to get to the bottom of what happened.
Right. Like, did they mess up? Did they break the law?
Mm-hmm.
Did they intentionally let Epstein off easy?
Right. Were there any bad intentions here?
Right.
So what did they find?
Yeah.
Well, it's complicated.
Okay.
Ultimately, the OPR concluded that Acosta and the other prosecutors didn't technically commit professional misconduct.
Hold on.
Yeah.
If they didn't break any rules, then why was everyone so upset?
That's a great question, and that's where things get interesting.
Okay.
The OPR report acknowledged that while no laws were broken, Acosta did exercise poor judgment in resolving the case with this MPA.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what exactly did Acosta do wrong, even if it wasn't, like, technically illegal?
Well, one of the key issues was Acosta's reliance on the concept of federalism.
Federalism.
Yeah, it's a big, complicated legal term.
Okay.
But basically it means that both the federal government and the state governments have their own powers and responsibilities.
Oh, okay. So like a checks and balances kind of thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Acosta argued that the federal government should act as a backstop to the state authorities, encouraging them to take stronger action.
Okay.
But the OPR felt that he went too far, deferring too much to the state, and potentially underestimating the federal government's role in prosecuting a case like this.
So they're saying that he was maybe a little too hands-off?
Yeah.
A little naive about the state's ability to handle a high-profile case like this?
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Okay.
The OPR also found that Acosta made this deal before some key parts of the investigation were even finished.
Oh, wow.
He agreed to some unusual terms in the MPA without really thinking through all the angles.
So it sounds like he was in a hurry to just get this case off his desk.
Yeah, that's the impression the report
Okay.
gives.
Wow.
And that's not all.
What else?
The OPR also criticized how the victims were treated.
Right, they weren't consulted at all during this whole MPA process.
Exactly. And the OPR agreed.
Okay.
They said that even if it wasn't legally required at the time,
Right.
that lack of communication with the victims was a big problem.
Yeah.
Treating victims with respect and keeping them informed is crucial even when there's no legal obligation to do so.
Yeah, I mean, just because something's not illegal doesn't make it right.
Exactly.
Right.
The OPR report made it clear that the government's actions, while maybe not technically misconduct, went against the spirit of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, that CVRA we mentioned earlier.
Right, so let's talk a little bit more about this CVRA.
Yeah.
It seems like this law is at the heart of why so many people felt like justice wasn't served in the Epstein case.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
The CVRA was created to give victims a voice in the legal process. It guarantees them certain rights, like the right to be informed about the case, the right to be present at court proceedings, and the right to be heard.
So why didn't the CVRA protect Epstein's victims?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, at the time of the MPA, the CVRA wasn't as clearly defined as it is today.
Okay.
Back then, the Department of Justice's interpretation was that the CVRA only kicked in after charges were filed,
Okay.
since Epstein was never charged federally.
Right.
The OPR said the prosecutors weren't legally required to consult with the victims.
So like a legal loophole, basically.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
However, the OPR didn't let the Department of Justice off the hook completely.
Okay.
They emphasized that regardless of the legal technicalities, the lack of communication with the victims reflected poorly on the entire justice system.
Yeah, they're basically saying, look, you might not have broken the law, but you sure didn't uphold the spirit of the law.
Exactly. They highlighted that the government's actions eroded public trust and created this perception of unfairness, especially when it came to protecting the rights of victims.
So we have this powerful man
Yeah.
accused of these terrible crimes.
Right.
A controversial agreement is made that lets him avoid serious consequences. And then you have the victims who are completely ignored and silenced.
Yeah.
It's a pretty damning picture of how the system failed to deliver justice.
It's tough.
Yeah, and it really raises some important questions.
It does.
Like, how do we make sure something like this doesn't happen again?
Right.
How do we ensure that victims have a real voice in the legal process?
Those are questions we're still wrestling with today. But before we get into all that, there's another piece of this puzzle we need to address.
Okay.
Remember, Epstein never actually faced federal charges for the crimes he was accused of in Florida.
Right. He died by suicide in jail in 2019 while awaiting trial on new federal charges in New York.
That's right. So in a sense, the legal battle in Florida ended tragically and without a definitive resolution.
It's a lot to unpack, and we're not done yet.
Not even close.
We need to talk about the lasting impact of this case and the lessons that we can learn from it. What does this all mean for the future of the justice system?
It's a lot to process, right?
It is.
We've gone from the beaches of Palm Beach to the halls of justice.
Yeah.
And through it all, there's this unsettling feeling that the system didn't quite work the way it should have.
It's a case that forces us to confront. It makes you wonder, could something like this happen again?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
The Epstein case, with all of its complexities and shortcomings, serves as a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It shines a light on the importance of laws like the Crime Victims' Rights Act.
Right.
And the constant need to reevaluate how we ensure that those rights are truly protected.
You mentioned earlier that the CVRA was kind of vague back when the Epstein case was unfolding.
It was.
Has it changed since then?
It has, absolutely.
Okay.
The Department of Justice has clarified its interpretation of the CVRA, and there's been a greater emphasis on victim involvement throughout the legal process.
Okay.
And courts have also recognized the importance of victim participation even before charges are filed.
So that's a positive step, right?
Definitely.
It means that victims have a stronger legal footing now than they did back then.
They do.
Yeah.
But laws and interpretations can only go so far.
Right.
We also need a cultural shift.
Okay.
A real commitment to putting victims at the center of the justice system.
So what does that actually look like in practice?
It means ensuring that victims are informed at every stage of the process, that their voices are heard, and that their rights are respected.
Yeah.
It means creating a system where they feel empowered, not silenced.
So it's about more than just ticking boxes on a legal checklist.
Right. It's about treating victims with dignity and empathy.
Right.
It's about recognizing that the pursuit of justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, but also about healing and restoring those who've been harmed.
So after diving deep into this complex and troubling case, what's the takeaway?
Well, the Epstein case, as unsettling as it is, serves as a stark reminder that our pursuit of justice must be unwavering, even when it involves powerful individuals. It highlights the need for transparency and accountability in our legal system.
Yeah.
And most importantly, it underscores the crucial role that victims must play in the pursuit of justice.
Their voices must never be silenced.
Exactly. And as we move forward, it's a question we all need to grapple with. How can we create a system that truly empowers victims and ensures that justice is served regardless of wealth or influence?
It's a challenge, for sure, but one that we can't afford to ignore.
We can't.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
What would you do if you were in the victim's shoes?
Yeah.
How would you want to be treated by the justice system? What changes would you like to see?
Right.
It's something for all of us to ponder as we strive for a more just and equitable world.